And we're back now with our all-star panel. Gwen Ifill, the anchor of Washington Week and the PBS NewsHour. David Ignatius, columnist with the Washington Post. We're also joined by Susan Page, the Washington Bureau Chief of USA Today, and Dan Balz, the chief correspondent of the Washington Post, and I must say the unofficial dean of the political press corps here in Washington, which means he is the oldest member of the
You got that right, the oldest.
Except for me. I'm glad to see all of you. I want to talk to you about this thing that was in the Wall Street Journal on Friday, that the White House is suddenly, and they actually announced this, that they're going to, they have a new, quote, strategy to work with Congress on some things of mutual interest, and the Journal finds Republicans who say, yeah, they think they're ready to talk. Is this the new age of miracles here, or is this just some first of the year talk?
Here are two things. One, it's new front page news that people would think about working together. Two, most people don't believe it's actually going to happen. I mean, I think even what we heard on your program this morning about the Keystone Pipeline indicates that Republicans are determined to pass it, and the president is likely to veto it. And Senator Schumer told you they had the votes to sustain a veto. That doesn't sound much like cooperating on issues of common ground.
Do you think they have the votes to sustain a presidential veto, Dan?
I don't know. I think we'll have to see this debate play out. I think what the Journal piece looks at one aspect of what I think a lot of people are anticipating, which is that there are some areas where there is some mutual agreement between the White House and congressional Republicans. But there are also big areas of disagreement, and I think that the real question is how the Republicans try to balance those two needs. They want to be productive, they want to look like they're able to do some things, they want to show they can govern. At the same time, they have a constituency that wants certain things done that are anathema to the president. And so the new leadership in the Senate will have to balance that, and we'll see how Speaker Boehner handles it.
I would just say they may find the votes to sustain a presidential veto, but at this point, I don't see that they have the votes to do that.
Well, they're all reading the polls, and they certainly know that at least going into the session, they've got to sound like they're going to get along. They have to talk about bipartisanship and agreement on trade and energy policy and issues where there are small slivers of agreement, and then it can all fall apart later. But for now, this is what they have to all say.
I'll tell you about one thing I hear is that there is a deal in the works well along to do two big confirmations quickly in the Senate for the new Attorney General Loretta Lynch and for the new Secretary of Defense Ashton Carter. And that will be a display. If that happens, that would be a display of bipartisan cooperation. We can get something done. We'll give the president two key members of his cabinet that he wants.
David, one of the things that's, I would guess, is going to come up early on is this authorization to fight ISIS. And the president wants that. He wants Congress to give him the authorization. What exactly does that mean? We're supposedly fighting ISIS already.
The president is operating under existing authorities and insists that that's legal. There's been a lot of division and disagreement within the White House, within the administration, about whether it's wise to open this up to congressional debate. We saw what happened with the question of using military force in Syria a year and a half ago, how difficult that was. I think they'll seek some broad, enabling legislation and try to limit debate sharply. And I think they probably have Republican support for that approach. Certainly John McCain, Bob Corker, the new key figures on the Republican side, do not want to limit the president's hand in dealing with ISIS in Iraq.
Is there any good news on Iraq and Syria and that part of the world?
I'd say the only good news is that the advance of ISIS, this explosion out of Mosul in Iraq that seemed to be threatening Baghdad, has ended, and ISIS is now being pushed back. It's controlling the areas where it has a lot of people, but even in Anbar province, which is controlled by ISIS, the U.S. is moving in Apache helicopter gunships, several thousand eventually U.S. military personnel to aid the Sunnis in that area in gradually pushing back. So I'd say the good news is the bad news has ended, and we're now in a period of beginning to prepare for a longer fight.
Where do we see this whole situation involving Cuba, Gwen?
Well, that's one of the things that there are going to be hearings about, which they're going to discuss, which Congress has happened while they were out of town, and they want to have a word in edgewise. Also Iran, where there's going to be a lot. What's interesting with the Cuba issue, domestically, politically, is watching what happens to Republicans in Florida who want to run for president, and whether they can find some footing, some standing, especially with new, younger Cuban Americans who don't feel as strongly about the Castro regime as their parents may have. And therefore, they're showing up to vote, and that's who Barack Obama is speaking to.
I hear Republicans say that they're going to do everything they can. They will not confirm a new ambassador to Cuba. Obviously, you'll have the Florida Republicans who are taking a very hard line against this. But do you see this as an issue that's changing? I mean, I kind of think it is, quite frankly, myself. But what do you think, Susan?
Yes, I think it is an issue that's changing, and I think the Republicans can refuse to confirm an ambassador for sure. They can refuse to lift the embargo. That would take congressional action. But the steps that the president took, to the surprise of most of us last month, I think demonstrate the power he has on this issue. The power of a president, even if he's lame duck, even if his approval rating is below 50%, he can do big things. And I've been struck by the lack of furor over it when you get past the shores of Miami-Dade County. I think this is an issue that's changed, and the step will be impossible to reverse.
What do you think, Dan?
I agree with that. I think that, this is another example of a president who recognizes the limits he has dealing with Congress and the ability he has at least to push issues forward. He's done it on climate change, he's done it on immigration, he's now done it on Cuba. He is moving in a direction, I think, that they believe at the White House will be over time irreversible, even if they can't get everything done that they want to try to do in the next 2 years.
You can understand the feelings of some of the Florida Republicans. They're the children of parents who had their businesses confiscated and all of that. But there is a large market down there, and the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, which is one of the backbones of finance for the Republican Party, is saying, look, we need to get down there and start selling
it's
those
a big opportunity for Cuban American business people, for U.S. business in general. I just would say one final thing about this issue of whether bipartisanship is back. The President has decided that he wants to make trade and trade agreements part of his legacy. He can't do that without Republican votes, and in that sense, the Republican gains in the midterm elections are good news in terms of getting trade legislation passed. It will be easier. And that's part of what I think the White House is saying. This is crucial to us. It's important to you. Let's try to do this part together.
I think hanging over all of this is this continuing uneasy conversation about race in America, which seems to kind of come down and sort of have an impact on every issue, no matter what it is. Gwen, where does this go?
I was rereading, this is not a plug, but I was rereading a chapter of my book that I wrote in 2009, The Breakthrough of Black Politicians, right when Barack Obama was being nominated, and there was all of this hope. And Ed Brooke, who died yesterday, the first black senator since Reconstruction, said at the time that there were so many things he wanted to accomplish before he was laid to rest. And he had sent the president a copy of his book, and the president had sent him a copy of his book, and they basically said to each other, you paved the way, and yes, I'm proud of you for that. It was an amazing extreme between two firsts. But all these years later, I don't know, I never thought that would fix everything. And so here we are still. Every button we push gets people worked up, whether it's a button about a policeman being shot, a button about a young black man being shot, a button about a movie, which all of a sudden is being treated as a documentary rather than as a historical retelling. A couple of months ago, maybe it was last year during the anniversary of Brown versus Board, I talked to Bob Moses, who was one of the organizers of the young protesters in the South, and he said he'd seen the play All the Way, the Bryan Cranston play about Johnston, and I asked him if he liked it, and he went, well, we were never all in the room at the same time. He took issue with the historical accuracy of that play, yet it went on to many plaudits. This movie, which is called Selma, not King, not Johnson, somehow is being attacked because of its lack of historical accuracy about a portion of it. So I've seen the movie, I've talked to the director, I've talked to people involved in it, and it set out to tell a different story, and that's a story of the protesters.
Explain this to me, since you've talked to the director. Did they think it was not a good enough story, that they had to change history? Because clearly they did.
Did they think that of the play All the Way? So they changed history?
But I'm talking about
Did they think that of
movie.
Mississippi Burning, which changed history? This play, the part about it being Johnson's idea, that Selma wasn't Johnson's idea. Even though he did say those words we heard on the tape, there had been years of planning to use Selma as the place for exactly that protest. So yes, movies are selective. Yes, they're not documentaries, but it doesn't mean that the movie itself and the larger story it tells is not valuable.
Well, I wouldn't disagree with that, but does it not hurt because so many young people, the only history they know is what they see in the movies sometimes, or what they see on television. And I worry about the danger of sort of misinforming people. This is a wonderful story. I mean, it's a great story. I didn't see that they needed to make it better in order to make it a good movie, make the story a better story. And that's the part I don't understand.
Have you seen the movie? Because if you see the movie, it's not really about that. And it's not about making it better. There is a tremendously powerful story that is told which has very little to do with the plot points involving Johnson. That's all I'm saying.
It's such a frustrating thing about race, and we hear it even this morning on your show, is such a sad day with Officer Liu being put to rest. But surely we can have a discussion about police tactics, the tactics by some police toward African American, especially African American boys and men, without attacking the police force, while recognizing the danger that police officers have and the trust we put in them, but also that clearly there's something wrong in some places with the way the police behave toward black people. And we see that with the video of Eric Garner. So the frustrating thing is trying to have a discussion that recognizes both things, the contribution of police, but also the need to have this discussion about
But I mean,
race.
the irony of we have the first African-American president, and we're talking about our race relations better or worse than they were when he came to office. I don't know if they are or not. And I certainly don't blame him for the situation that we have here. But it is interesting that that's the question we're talking about.
Well, the president who did the interview with Steve Inskeep on NPR just before Christmas said he thinks actually relations are better today than they were when he came into office. Now, other people would probably dispute that. One of the interesting things to me about this, we know from everything we've seen over many years that blacks and whites see these issues differently. One of the interesting things is now white Republicans and white Democrats see these issues differently. When we went back and looked at our most recent poll on some of these questions, what was striking was not just the gap between blacks and whites, but how differently whites who call themselves Republicans or whites who call themselves Democrats take dramatically different view of this. So there is now a partisan overlay on what has been a long racial discussion in America, which I think makes it even more difficult to get to resolution.
I think one of the really poignant parts of Barack Obama's presidency is that our first African-American president has also tried to be president for all the country. And you know, that puts him in the middle on these incredibly difficult issues. And he got attacked this morning by former Speaker Gingrich. He gets criticized regularly from African Americans who say he isn't doing enough. The other thing, I was struck listening to the conversation today, you wouldn't know that community policing is one of the big success stories in America. Yeah. Listening to this discussion. The LAPD, which had a terrible problem, doesn't have that problem now because it learned about community policing. And somehow that's got to be, I think, the practical lesson that people take out of this period. Let's make that work.
Let's talk about, we have only 2 years to talk about this. So let's go to 2016. You saw Mike Huckabee announced he's leaving Fox News, and so I assume he's going to run for president. Yet another Republican, Newt Gingrich, was saying, you know, they're going to have a lot of runners, but no front runners yet. How does this on the Republican side sort itself out, Susan?
Well, we do have a front runner. We have a front runner. His name is Jeb Bush. You know,
you really think he's a front runner?
I mean, I don't think he's a prohibitive front runner. I don't think polls at this point matter a whit. But certainly, let's talk about him because that's really what we do. And I think there's a test for him. It's been 12 years since he ran for office. He needs to show that he's, you know, got his campaign legs back. But we're going to have a slew of Republicans. We're going to have Tea Parties for the Tea Party nomination and for the establishment for nomination and for the Christian conservative nomination, and I say, isn't that great?
What do you think, Dan?
Well, I think that what's interesting to me right now is that some of what we might call the old timers are being the most aggressive. Jeb Bush, Jeb Bush has done more in the last few weeks to try to shape this race in his direction than we would have thought. We assumed that he would wait until after the new year, probably sometime into January, to give a signal. Instead, he did it much earlier than that as a way of saying, pay attention to me, I am serious about this. Governor Huckabee, what he did yesterday, the same kind of thing. Each of them has something they have to prove. As Susan says, Jeb Bush may be something of a front runner, but he has as much to prove as anybody in the race. And so this is not a shapeless race, but it's a very unpredictable race.
You know, I thought it was interesting. Bush, among other things, resigned from all his boards that he is a member of. And,
anticipating the criticism which could come his way. As
and
Dan knows, I waited all through 2014 not talking about this campaign. Now it's 2015. We're at the starting gate. Let's go for it.
But what I loved about it is the New Yorker, in a parody, said that he had also announced he was resigning as George W. Bush. I'm guessing that Mitt Romney is not going to run. I had convinced myself that he was really thinking seriously about doing it, and I know he was talking to his friends about it. But my guess is, with Bush in the race, Romney will not be in the race. Does anybody?
I think he was interested in running. I think he was, to a surprise, almost up to himself, that he was interested in running. But I think that door is kind of
closed.
Have you
ever met a presidential candidate, anyone who ever ran for president, who ever gave up thinking about it again?
That's right.
That even if it's completely improbable, that it gets infected in their blood, and they always think, somewhere Al Gore is thinking about running.
Yeah.
You know, George McGovern told me that very thing once. I asked him years after he ran in 1972, and then, of course, he ran. I said, did you ever... not that he said no. He said you never get over it, and I mean I think that's exactly right. Now we haven't talked about on the Democratic side. It's Hillary Clinton and who else?
You talk about a prohibitive front runner. Her name is Hillary Clinton. You know, I think at this point, even this far out, she could lose this or decide not to run, but it's going to be really hard to take it away from her.
Who would?
Well, that's part of I think part of the Democrats' problem. There's a lot of energy on the Republican side. We're talking about Bush and Huckabee and Perry, and you know, there's a Marco Rubio, Rand Paul, a long list of attractive candidates. And on the Democratic side, you have Secretary Clinton not yet announcing, but taking up that space. And then beyond her, who? And it's striking.
It's called the Lightning Strikes Caucus. The people waiting for lightning to strike.
People may be waiting for lightning to strike, but it's a really interesting contrast. And I think it should worry Democrats that there's not a generation coming up. If Hillary Clinton's announced tomorrow she wasn't running, who would step in? Who would be?
I would say Joe Biden, but I don't know who else I would add to that. I mean, Martin O'Malley.
He would say Joe Biden, but I don't know how many others would.
That's not the generational shift you're talking about, though.
Yeah, I would assume the vice president would run if she doesn't, and there will be some others who run. You mentioned Governor O'Malley; he's probably going to run, although maybe not. But
we'll have to find out who the others are later because we've run out of time. Thank you, guys. Thanks, all of you. We'll be right back.